All right. Take it away, sir.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Um, Today's talk is about Ekan Daishi, a lady. If you've read your STO news bulletin, you already know all the facts about her. Um, there are very few facts. Unfortunately, the record keepers, the historians back in those days, didn't pay a whole lot of attention to women. Um, Essentially, what's reported is that Ekan was Kaizen's mother. Kaizen, very important person in the history of Soto Zen. He was the fourth patriarch after Dogen, um, and he is known as the mother of Zen. Dogen was the father, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Ekan's mother was named Mayhew, and she was a big supporter of Dogen, a student of his, and also a financial supporter. We don't know a whole lot more about her either. But Ekan was a nun and abbess of Jojuji convent. And as a little side note, her niece Myoshini became the abbot of Hoji convent. It was the first convent built for women, in Soto convent built for women in Japan, and it was built by Kaizen, her son, to honor his mother Ekan. Kaizen vowed to help all women in the three worlds in the 10 directions. Now, we'll talk a little more about him a little bit later. So, what more can be said? I think the important thing is you look at this lady's existence in the context of the political situation at the time, the social situation, and it just shows what a very wonderful person she must have been, what a strong person she must have been. Politically, back in the 13th and 14th centuries, these were the days in Japan, the days of the shogunates, the shoguns, the samurais, the local warlords. Monasteries, priests were very much under the control of the government. If you wanted to be a priest, you had to go register with the government. In some way, they ranked you. And the important priests then got to deal with the important people, the rich people. The other priests, history doesn't say a whole lot about, so I don't know what they did. As far as Soto Zen, by this time, it's pretty much dying out in Japan. It's already died out practically in China. Of course, in China, it was not known as Soto. I believe it was the Keodong school of that Dogen brought over. But it was a very, very risky time for Soto Zen. It could have easily gone away. The upper class, they had it made pretty much. Their upper class women were treated better and everything. One specific, the full ordination for women had lapsed in Japan in the 9th century. This is like 400 years before Dogen's even here, or Ekan. So things aren't looking real good for Zen, Soto Zen, or for women at this time. It's a tough place to be. But as a little side note, if you look around today, the shoguns are gone, the samurais are gone, and Soto Zen is the leading Zen in Japan today. We'll talk about that a little bit more also. So if that's a political situation, what's the situation for women? Let's get back all the way up to Buddha's time. The Brahminic rules were pretty much in effect at that time. Women had to have a male protector, either their father while they were growing up, or their husband, or their brother, or even if all those are dead, a son could be his mother's protector. Women were believed to be mentally inferior. There are some wonderful stories about some magic sex changes for women. They couldn't get ahead as women, so magically they would turn into men, and then everything was okay. And the big desire at that time for women is rebirth as a man. So just hang in there, women. Everything's okay because you'll eventually come back as a man and you can make it. It was a time of child marriages, forced marriages. The Buddha preached against such practices. But even by the time you get to Dogen's time, things don't seem like they're much better for women. They weren't even allowed in training monasteries. And I'm not sure what a training monastery is. I take that to be a monastery where there are resident males. And to get outside Japan just a little bit for the interest of women, in Southeast Asia, the nuns' orders had actually already died out. And so now if you wanted to be a nun and you were from Thailand or any of those Southeast Asian, the Theravadan countries, you couldn't do it because one of the requirements to become a nun, you had to have women nuns to make you a nun. And since there were no women nun left, no women could be nuns, even though it was okay for them to be so. So the men said, well, we're not discriminating. It's not our fault there's no women. Thank goodness that's changed somewhat. Actually, they a few years back, and this is pretty much up into modern times, but they sent a team of women from Southeast Asia to India where there had some women nuns and got them qualified so they could go back to Southeast Asia and do the ceremony for women. And now they got a team that actually travels around Southeast Asia for women that want to become nuns. Another little side note, this is one nice thing about being the speaker. I can put in little side notes. It's really hard not to judge people from prior times by today's standards, but it's really important that we be aware of that. For the Buddha, for instance, in his times, things were bad for women. It wasn't his fault. He became enlightened, but the society he lived in didn't. So he still had to live within certain restrictions. So, and even today, I look back when I grew up, small southern town, segregation was taken for granted. That's just the way it was. I'm not saying it was right, but that was the situation, and there was very little you could do to change it, or very few people were willing to do it. But anyway, does that make me a bad guy because I grew up as a segregationist as a child? Well, if you want to, there's some people would say, yeah, you're a racist background and we'll destroy your name, tear down a statue they built to you or whatever. So that's enough of that. Another little side, equality of women within Buddhist countries. Martine Batchelor, the wife of Stephen Batchelor. Now, why did I have to say that? On her own, she was a very powerful woman. She wrote a book called Walking on Lotus Flowers. And according to her, and this is her opinions, and I don't know how she came up with them, but in Korea, women are 90% equal with men in the Buddhist world. Taiwan was 85%, Japan 60%, Tibet 45%, and good old Southeast Asia, Thailand came in at 15%. Anyway, moving right along. So we've talked about the political situation and the sorry status for women in that world. Let's go back and look at some of the important people. How about the Buddha himself? His aunt, Mahapajapati, actually raised him after his mother died. And Pajapati wanted to join his Sangha, but he refused to let her join. Ananda, one of his main disciples, comes to the rescue of women, and he talks to the Buddha about this. And the Buddha finally comes to the conclusion, and this is like 5 years after he had started his program, but he comes to the conclusion that there's no reason why women can't be awakened. Therefore, they're equal with men in that respect. But to join his Sangha, he had 8 special rules. I'm not going to go into the rules, but I'll tell you, there are 8 rules said that any woman nun or any woman in the Sangha or a nun had to be subservient to the men priest. Even if that woman had been there 15 years and was fully awakened, and you got a brand new 18-year-old priest that comes in, the woman has to be subservient to the male. Does that make the Buddha a bad guy? We can't give absolute answers to things that happened 2,500 years ago. One of the theories is that the Buddha, in his awakened state and for his love for all beings, wanted to protect women. And he thought this would be the best way to protect them, that to give them full status within the community. First off, all his men priests might have quit and gone away. They may not have been willing to accept this. But anyway, the theory is that a lot of bad guys around, and by keeping women in their place, so to speak, he was protecting them. I don't know. I don't know about that. But the Buddha did show quite a amount of respect for women. He talked about things such as he was against forced marriages and child marriages. He was even against polygamy. Now that's a biggie. But he wasn't against polygamy. He was just against it if it was limited to men. So I guess he thought women could have multiple spouses if men could. Anyway, so the Buddha did a lot of talking about the equality of women, even though he was perhaps a little slow in showing it. So if we jump forward 1,700 years to Dogen, the father of Soto Zen, what did he think about women? He was a pretty big supporter of women. He said all beings are Buddha nature. If you remember, the answer to the koan was, does even a dog have Buddha nature, is Mu. Dogen did this wonderful stroke of reasoning and says it's not a matter of all beings having something outside them called Buddha nature, but they are Buddha nature. Women are as much Buddha nature as men. Everything and everybody's Buddha nature. Emptiness is emptiness, whether you're male or female. He said women have the same capability, and that both men and women can attain the way. He actually had women students at his monastery, Fukakoze, and there are many references in his writings as to women, and he asked the question, why are men so special? Unfortunately, all these writings of Dogen has gotten hidden away for centuries, not just about the women, but all of his writings. So remember, he had been forced up into the mountains, and his writings stored somewhere, and they were found later and became public. But the problem with Dogen, even though he did a lot of writing, the Buddha was talking and Dogen was writing, he didn't do anything as far as institutionalizing the system for women. Um, remember Ekan? Now, Ekan is the lady that we're talking about today. We'll get to her eventually, don't worry. Her name was Maochi. She was a student of Dogen and provided much financial support. But Dogen was literally forced out of Kyoto. That was the capital of Japan at the time. Uh, he had much conflict with the existing powerful religions at the time, the Tendai and Rinzai groups. They had already gotten in with the powerful warlords and shoguns, and they didn't appreciate this new guy with a new idea coming along to compete with them. So he actually had to move out into the mountains just to get away from them. There's a good thing on Wikipedia if you want to read about that one. That was one of my sources. So I'm going to jump ahead of Ekan now to her son, Kazan. He was the fourth patriarch after Dogen and is known as the mother of Zen. I guess they would have called him a father, but Dogen already had that title. He founded a big monastery that's big today called Sojiji. It's one of the two top Soto Zen monasteries in Japan today. He also wrote a very famous book called the Denko Roku, or the Transmission of the Lamp, which is a famous compilation of writings from the past. But he not only, while Buddha was talking and Dogen was writing, Kazan did a bunch of stuff. He took action. And remember, at this time, women aren't even allowed into the teaching monasteries. So it's not like he's not upsetting the apple cart here. He started 5 convents during his time for women. That's a biggie. I've got that underlined in my notes. He institutionalized a system to promote women in the future. He just didn't talk and write, he did things. He was the first that gave transmission to a woman. Her name was Ekan Daishi. And Kazan over and over praised his mom and his grandmother, and he vowed to help women everywhere. He said that they were the ones responsible for him becoming a priest. Kazan entered a monastery at age 7, became a monk at 13, and an abbot at age 35. But don't forget, this is still a very precarious time for Soto Zen in Japan. The good thing is that he's out in the mountains now. Actually, Kazan is way over on the west coast in Kanazawa. If you triangulated Kyoto and Tokyo and went to the west coast, you'd find Kanazawa. So he's not down there among the rich and famous and powerful competing for that kind of stuff. He's over in his monastery in the mountains doing his own thing. And we're going to get to Ekan in just a minute, I promise. I'd like to review just to keep it straight. Myochi was Ekan's mother. She was a student and supporter of Dogen. She actually raised Kazan until he was 8 years old. We don't know what happened to Ekan during those 8 years. No historical record available. But she, along with 30 nuns, followed Kazan around, and he liked his grandma so much, he actually named a shrine after her at the big monastery. Myoshin was Ekan's niece. She became the abbess of Huji, which is one of the convents that Ekan started. And then the final name we mentioned was Ekan Daishi, and she was the first woman to receive transmission in the Soto Zen line. That was in the year 1325. Take a break. Anybody got any questions so far? I've never talked this much.
Ungan, let me get you, because we have some new people. You mentioned Theravada. Can you speak just a tad bit on what Theravada is versus, who made that comment? I just want to make sure folks are.
Theravada was the original Buddhism that was began in the time of the Buddha, and it when the Buddhists were essentially ran out of India by the Muslim invasion, that Theravadan, I'm not sure they call it Theravada, but that the Buddhism of the ancestors goes there and stayed pretty much pure to their original teachings, including all the bad crap against women. But the Theravadins are still around today, and they're in the United States, and things have changed a whole lot. Like the Insight Meditation Group is a Theravada group today, so we're talking about a whole lot of difference between then and now. Theravada, the Mahayanist, what was the name of we got Mahayanist and Hinayanist. Theravadins were sort of Hinayanist, I guess. They were worried about saving themselves only. And then the Mahayanists come along, we want to try to save all beings. Does that help at all? Thank you.
Thank you.
I just had one comment. The point that Ungan's trying to make about Ekan, and it's actually true of all the ancestors, they were not isolates. They didn't pop up out of the inside their mind. They didn't just suddenly appear by magic. They were part of a network and nexus of history and practitioners and the social and political climate of the time. The reason Rinzai was favored in Japan, first of all, it got there about 400 years earlier. And the shoguns who ruled Japan were largely military class. And they needed a rigorous kind of practice such as Rinzai because they were in danger of their lives at all times. Soto Zen was more laid back, more for everybody, not for the royalty or the court or the military leaders. It was more for the little guy. It was for villagers. It was for farmers. And so part of the reason Dogen was unpopular, as Ungan was saying, is he claimed that this new thing he brought back from China, which later was called Soto Zen, was the real thing. And Rinzai had some, according to him, had some issues. So it would be like if we Buddhist Zen practitioners tried to take over the Catholic Church or something like that. It wouldn't be a good idea. But Ekan, her mother, and her grandmother were all part of the surrounding cultural context of Master Dogen at that time. Keizan, being about 3 generations later, extended Dogen's teaching, but he really propagated it all over Japan by building monasteries, convents, and so on. So it's important for us trying to look back on the history of Zen, not to mythologize it too much. And I think what Ungan is doing is a very good job of helping us understand the complexity of the dynamic of its growth in Japan at that time, Soto Zen, being something new introduced into that culture. And frankly, we have the same kind of situation here in America today. We're introducing something which is not really like Christianity. It's not antagonistic to it, or Judaism, or Islam, but it's very definitely different. And so we have a similar problem to Dogen's in propagating Zen in this country.
Thank you, Jojo. Yeah, I thought I made that point before about one reason that Soto could be successful. They were not competing with Rinzai down in the capital. They were out in the mountains going to the common folks and women, and they even started like funeral services for commoners, which apparently they wasn't very popular at the time. So anyway, Ekan, she founded 2 temples herself, 2 convents, Hojiji and Jojiji, and they took their practice to helping orphans, lepers, abused women, and so you can see how they get popular. I mean, they grow. They're not down in the capital trying to ingrain themselves with the rich and powerful. They're out helping the poor people and the common people and the women. They actually, Ekan was a nun at the Jojiji. She was an abbess at there also. And it's an order of nuns that have the plum blossom symbol. So if you see a plum blossom, you can think about Ekan. They actually started a orphanage back during the Second World War in Japan. And you can imagine how much that was needed. The orphanage is still available, as is this convent. As a mother of this famous guy, Kazan, she is also known to have criticized him severely for getting the big head about all his success. So I think that shows she was active not only in her own right as a abbess in creating monasteries and all that. She was very much involved in her son's life. A couple little side stories about her. She was 37 years old or 36 and still didn't have any children. And I don't know what the age expectancy was back in those years, but I imagine 37 years old was a pretty old woman. Anyway, she prayed to Kannon, who was her favorite bodhisattva, and got pregnant and had Kazan. And again, we talked about before, we don't know what happened. She got separated from her son during that first 7 or 8 years of life. And she was feeling bad about that, so she prayed to Kannon. And then this mysterious woman appears and says, well, your son's over there if you'll go over there. And she goes over there, and sure, there's her son. And so she gets reunited with her son. The important thing, due to her influence, her actions, and her influence on her son, she may well have been one of the biggest influences on saving Soto Zen. Again, there's, back when, in the Tang Dynasty, when Yuanning they had 5 houses of Zen, 5 very powerful, strong houses. 3 of them are already gone by this time. So just because you form a monastery or a group doesn't mean it's going to be around forever. So, in closing, let me summarize. The Buddha, apparently with reservations, accepted women, but with limitations. He did a lot of talking about it, and that's good. Dogen accepted women, including Ekan's mom, Maochi. She was a student of his, as well as a financial supporter. But he was big in writing things. So we had Buddha talking, Dogen writing, and then Ekan comes along and gives birth to Kazan and led him into the priesthood, again, potentially saving Soto Zen through her son's activities. Kazan openly supported women and commoners and institutionalized Soto Zen for them. And so along with his mother, who he credited for his success, and she was very successful in her own right as far as founding convents and being abbess. So If we ever do a Jukai for a woman in Jacksonville, she'd probably get the name Ekan. It's a great story. So does anybody have any questions or?
I just want to make one announcement. Shenzhen Mike Goldman is sitting in as the prime questioner. Shenzhen Mike Goldman is sitting in as the prime questioner for this talk. He usually gives a talk on the ancestors this week, the third Sunday, and so he's acting as host. So any questions that we do not come up with for Ungan, I'm sure Shenzhen will.
Okay. Well, my first question, going through the history that you've detailed very well here, it seems like for each of these watershed moments for women's, not only their participation in Zen, but how they were treated by the world of Zen, you've got a comment, something along the lines of Soto Zen dying out and very risky in Japan, or Soto Zen was not in good shape during this period. Do you see any connection between those two things?
Karmic connections, boy, that's a tough one. After Dogen was forced out into the mountains away from the capital, and Kazan was way over on the west coast, I'm not surprised that Soto Zen was in the decline. The Rinzais and the Tendais, they had the support of the money and the power of the government behind them. Again, you couldn't even be a priest unless you went down to the government and registered. So I think the way they got away with it, in fact, is by not being at the capital and out working with the poor folks and the women and the commoners, not competing down in the capital. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. Sometimes I
No,
didn't.
it does, but it kind of leads me to the next one. Is I've been here for 26 years now, and women have always held pivotal roles here. And as a matter of fact, we would not be here if it was not for the participation of a lot of the women that have been here. So, do you see that as a recurring trend in the history of Zen?
Oh yeah. Back to the statistics that Martine Batchelor put in, I noticed it was very apparent. She didn't mention the United States. I think the United States is so big and complicated, it's hard to say. It's where you are, but certainly just in the last 25 years, the women, thank goodness, are becoming more and more involved and powerful within the Zen world. My original place, Daibuzatsu Zendo, now has a woman abbot, the first Rinzai abbot in the United States. Ada Roshi appointed her as fully transmitted, and she became abbot after he got kicked out for chasing women. So yeah, I think it's wonderful. But you look all around us. You look at all the different groups. The Theravadins, I can't speak for. I'm not sure. The Tibetans, I'm not sure about. But if you start talking about the Insight Meditation group and all those powerful women, and Hojo's transmission teacher was a woman down, what was her name?
My preceptor, Sarah Barbara Cohn of the Suzuki Land. But I did want to point out that where Ungan is saying accepted women or didn't accept women, we mean in the special context of, Dogen's mother died when he was 7 or 8 years old. Buddha's died in childbirth. It is not that those individual leaders did not somehow or were misogynist or didn't accept women, period. It's just within the formal confines of the transmission of the Buddha Dharma and the way they set up the order or the structure for transmitting it in those days. It was more a matter of they accepted the complexity of allowing both genders to be in residence. And everybody knows that, you know, we're all complicated beings individually. And when you put a boys club together, you know, you haven't eliminated a lot of complexity, but you've eliminated some. And when it becomes open to all, then you have to be able to deal with the higher degree of complexity that brings on. And I think the perspective was what we're trying to do in Zen is so hard that you're really better off as a hermit off in a cabin by yourself with nobody else around trying to do it. But when you introduce it into a social context, then it becomes much more complex. This is why lay practice was always admired, because the Vimalakirtis, the layman Pang, his daughter, and all of those people, Ashoka, who somehow managed to balance normal, complicated life of marriage, family, business, politics, you know, the whole shebang, the whole catastrophe, as far as the Greek would say. Somehow balance that with a Zen life and actually be able to achieve that. They were very highly admired. Monks, monastics by comparison, were actually lay people were held up as examples to the monastics. The monastics were not thought as being a superior threat. Now, here in America, we don't see the future as monastic at all, frankly, in our lineage. I mean, there will be monasteries and so forth, but if it's not for everybody, who's it for? And so we're doing the same juggling act, balancing our daily lives and our Zen practice, but it's for everyone, and we accept the complexity of the lay practice life, and that's the future of Zen.
And I have to shamelessly do a plug as a part of the work and being in lay practice, as we are lay practice here at ASZC. We have podcasts that actually really talk about. We have lay practitioners, and two of them are sitting at the end. Can you raise your hand? We have Inga and Kayasak. Again, something that rolled out of the way that we practice here, and with Sensei support of being able to really. We have practitioners that are lay practitioners talking about what it looks like to actually do lay practice. And householders, yes. So please, as a part of that conversation, please do utilize all of the resources that we have. We also have Sensei's podcast as well. But Ungan, I did have to have a question for you. A comment that you said, and you emphasized it 2 times about how the Buddha. Can you hear me? Okay. The Buddha, he talked about it. Dogen wrote about it, and then Kaizen actually did something about it.
Right.
So I feel that you emphasized that twice, but that really is an opportunity to look at how, different people bring different things. And that's really not a bad thing, because you don't want a robot like replicating everything. Hojo's not making little Hojo senseis in this practice. He's always talking about how that looks like, what it looks like. What does your practice look like? What is it for you to do? But work on this first, and then figure it out. So can you comment about really, because you mentioned it twice about, the Buddha, said something, Dogen wrote about it, and then we had some action. Is there a reason that you emphasize that twice, or is there, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, you just did. I don't know what else to say. No, I just thought it was sort of cute to put in a presentation, but I think it's a lot of truth there, and but people have to react according to the environment they're in. I don't think, had Buddha stood up and started writing and opening convents, I think all his men followers would have probably ran away and left him. I don't know that, but it could have happened. And the same with Dogen. He had been kicked out of the capital. Even though he accepted women as students, you have to be careful what you do. Just because you feel strongly about something, you have to be practical about how you go about solving the problems. Oh, I've got one more. I forgot this one. Did you have a question or no? Oh, too bad. One of the little statistics I left out was rules. It's back after the Buddha and his group started advancing. They came up with 250 rules for men. That's a lot of rules. Well, guess how many the women had? They had 383. My point being about rules, it seems like every time an organization starts and the bureaucracy starts, somebody has to start making rules. And some of them are essential. You need rules to control things. But some people really seem to just really get so involved, they get this feeling of power or whatever, because I made the rules, I'm in charge. So I think there's a lesson in there for all of us to be careful about making rules and make only those rules that are actually necessary and needed. I'll rest my preaching there.
I can't help but kind of have a reaction that the Buddha thought about it, Dogen wrote / spoke about it, Kaizen actually took action. That's in the same order as the Eightfold Path, and that was given to us in a specific order, and thought is followed by speech, is followed by action. It just was a 1,500-year gap between.
Well, remember the three actions in Buddhism are of body, mouth, and mind.
Right.
And so what Buddha did by acceding to Ananda's request, and they held a parliament or something, they agreed to allow women to join the order, including his aunt who had raised him, and his son by his wife, or rather his wife and son, both joined the order as disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was taking great action in that context. When Dogen welcomed nuns into the monastery, that was taking great action in that context.
Right.
And when Kazan expanded that and made that policy, that was also taking great action. But I think Shingen's take on this is probably the correct one. That's the way everything happens. It happens in those kinds of stages.
And back to Ananda, when we did the Ancestor talk on Ananda and Mahakapasha in February, they were both very different guys personality-wise. And Ananda apparently was an extrovert that really loved people. And he would have had this inclusive kind of view, we need to have all of our families here, we need to have women here. And Mahakapasha was the opposite. He was very stern, very strict. Now, these are the rules. There's only one way to see this. But without both of them, the Buddhist movement probably wouldn't have survived.
And again, folks, please, if you have a question, comment, come off with mute, turn your camera on or not. Again, we welcome questions, comments. Is that Gyozan? Are you?
Yeah, I'm appearing. Here I am. Hello. Bill, thank you for your talk. It was wonderful, quite detailed and broad in scope. Wonderful to hear about these dimensions of our practice. I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about the importance in Mahayana of the Bodhisattva ideal, how that evolved from the Theravada, and specifically Avalokiteshvara's place, which started really sort of, I think, neutral in terms of gender, and then there was male reference, but over time, Kuan Yin appeared, and she presented with female characteristics, which I think are interesting. And also what comes to mind as well is Sanshin, or three minds, in terms of magnanimous and grandmotherly sort of, which also has, and joyful, which also has female characteristics. So it seems like the female is not, we can't separate it out, and so I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that. And I just wanted to say, in our own lives, right? We each have these dimensions, these energies of female and male. Every one of us does. And as I, as a male, approached and entered testopause, testosterone starts to fall off, and the influence of estrogen becomes more predominant. And as I got into my older years, I became more mellow and more sensitive, and there's qualities that begin to evolve in us males after testopause. And similarly with females, although they have both, similar kinds of characteristics become more predominant at certain phases of life. But if we fall to one side or the other, we get into trouble in terms of maleness or femaleness. Seems like we can't have one without the other, and be totally human. So that was a bit too much there, but I'm sure. But the question was about Avalokitesvara, I think, and the female dimension of her archetype. Thank you.
Larry, that was a mouthful.
Yeah. Well, how about Avalokitesvara?
Yeah. Well, I've thought before, think about the history of the world since men have been running everything. What's the world been like? We've had war after war after war. We've killed hundreds of millions of people because of greed and conquest and territorial boundaries. And I just wonder what it would have been like had women not been subjugated to the point they were from way back in history and had been on a more even balance with men. Hopefully the world would be a better place. And I'm hoping that's what happened now as women are advancing and becoming more powerful in the world. I'm hoping the whole thing will become more compassionate, but we'll have to wait and see about that.
Well, let me counter to that, because in many ways in corporate culture, as well, the way women become more advanced is they take on more male characteristics and essentially have to adapt themselves to the culture. I'm not saying that's totally the case in all cases, but that may not be the best thing.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I've overgeneralized completely. There are a lot of powerful women in the world already who aren't being very kind to us. So it's, but on balance, I think things would probably be better. But
yeah,
I'm not even sure about that.
That's for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and we do actually have Corolla, who is a physicist, a strong personality, and Amy Pico, and also have several women in the room. I would like to see what their thoughts and feelings are on some of what's being said. So
You're muted, Amy.
I'm saying, no, you really don't want to know what I think. But I am going to read something that echoes, I guess, my overall view that goes much broader than your talk, Ungan, but probably touches on some things. So we talk about Buddhism as being lay practice, but of course its history is not in lay practice. And so I sort of look at this from the perspective of a field that we know about now that of course no one knew about back then, which is epigenetics. And epigenetics now teaches us that essentially we have inside of us a lot of different behaviors, inclinations, thought patterns that due to our environment may become sort of influenced in one way, shape, or form. And the reason I bring that up is because in the growing research of epigenetics, we have learned that a behavior, so we're just taking an example of sexism, whatever that means to all of us. And if we were to track that from a research perspective, that thought form or that thought pattern can be replicated and seen over the course of 6 or 7 generations. So if you think about that concept, which has been backed up in epigenetic research, and how many generations of Buddhism that have consciously or unconsciously perpetuated sexist type behaviors and thought forms, then it would be safe to say that we still have it in our consciousness, right? Because this is something that has gone on for a long time and is still present in varying degrees in each one of us individually, right? Let alone the history of Buddhism in Japan. So I just read this now as a context. This is from Women of the Way. This is written by Sally Tisdale. Women historically have altogether different relationship to monastic practice than men. Since they haven't been free agents, they couldn't leave their families without permission. Others weren't willing to abandon aging parents or young children. Denied permission or constrained by duty, many women studied and practiced in private for decades. Some adopted the appearance and behavior of monks, not eating before noon, shaving their heads, and so on. In certain cases, a woman who waited until she was old to be ordained was treated as proof that women lack the great determination needed for real understanding. And I think that even in the West, as we have been pioneers in bringing women into Buddhism, I think it's important to remember that, and I'll speak for myself only, that in thought patterns and in behaviors, I think we still have quite a long way to go. Gasho.
Amen, Amy.
So yes, Muman, we were very interested in hearing what you had to say. So thank you so much for sharing. Ijun Corolla Butler, I saw you trying to come off of mute, but you have something to say.
Yes. I actually have 2 comments. One is that we need to cut Buddha and Dogen some slack because they had to work with the cultures they were embedded in. So Buddha was embedded in a culture where women had very little value. Similarly, he was embedded in a culture with gods and reincarnation, and he used those and went as far as he could without simply alienating everybody. And I think Dogen did the same thing. So they did what they could while sustaining the practice. And I think they should be commended for that. My other comment is about the spread of Soto Zen in the back country. And I think this was partly, and it's very closely parallels what happens with the Christians in the Roman Empire, is that by embracing what are considered female attributes, nurturing, caring, tending to the weak and the sick, they won the hearts of the local people. And this is by embracing the feminine side as opposed to Rinzai, which was very masculine and stern. And this might be a lesson for us as we're trying to make Zen more available in our culture, that we might think about those nurturing functions, funerals, christenings, all those other things that people kind of expect from a religious group. And it just gives me something to think about in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Corolla.
I had just a little footnote. Look at the iconography, the sculptures that began in Gandhara there are two aspects of them. The paintings were very different from Hindu. The Hindu were very sexualized, representatives of female and male counterparts. But the Buddhist ones are very androgynous by comparison. It's almost impossible to tell when you look at a figure of Bodhisattva Kuan Yin whether it's male or female. Avalokitesvara was considered male, Kuan Yin was considered female. The two were merged into one principle. And so the second aspect of it was the iconography looked like the local people. So it was saying two things. It's saying that Buddha nature is not gender, and the Buddha nature is not Indian. No, it's not Chinese, Japanese, American, Korean. It's you.
Thank you, Hojo Sensei. Let me just take a pause of the folks in the Zendo. Questions, comments? No. I think we're good there.
I don't know if I have a lot to say. I just was thinking a lot about the how maybe like having children can probably keep women from being a big part of the Zendo or the monasteries back then. Like, and I was even thinking about Ekan, that she had a child and then for years she wasn't like seeing it. I wonder if like she didn't see Kazan because of some form like, well, you can't like as a monk or a nun, you have to like leave behind your entire family. And you know, we even still nowadays don't have a lot for women as far as like childcare or like helping them, and it's always like on the woman to take care of the children. And I wonder if that has been like throughout time a reason why they haven't been as big of a part of the sangha and the monasteries and everything. Just a thought.
I would think so. I don't know, of course, but I can remember in the corporate world some years back that was a pretty prevailing attitude about, well, we want to hire that woman or this man. Well, if you hire this woman, she'd probably work 4 or 5 years and then quit to raise the kids. And you've spent all that money training her. And I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just saying that was a prevailing attitude among men management back in those days. And child raising, could be more important? But as whether or not that affected women in Zen, I don't see how it could not have, even though I don't really know.
As a quick coda to that, you certainly cannot ignore the biological any more than you can ignore the cultural. Well, you're just taking everything out of context if you do. There's one more point. As Shinjin said earlier, this place wouldn't be here without the activity of a lot of women. My wife happens to be one of those, but she does not want a public role. She doesn't want to be out front.
Well, one of the prevailing theories now about our very far back Stone Age ancestors was that men and women didn't even live together, that women lived in sedentary situations and mainly gathered plants, and men roved around in bands together hunting. And the effect that's had on us biologically is that the human eye in men and women functions very differently. Women are much better with detecting patterns, and they're much better at differentiating color because they had to identify plants, which plants were toxic, transporters. Men's eyes are much better at depth perception and tracking movement, which is how you hunt things down and kill them. But you know, so I mean, if we've come to this point starting from that, that's pretty remarkable.
And I do appreciate Inga's question. I can speak personally too. When I had a little kid, you know, my practice was very different. You know, my wife was assisting, you know, a lot of the times when we were away on like 2-week retreats. So it does take some collaboration. So I can see, you know, a lot of the female practitioners that are, you know, able to like do longer lifetime sits, do extended studies, they are older because you had that consideration of when you were, had a kid, you had a household to manage, and also it's taken too. So every time I say this, again, I want to say to Diane, if she's listening, again, we're so grateful for your practice and support behind the scenes. I know she's probably like, oh God, she's mentioning my name, but I just have to say that. But again, also, anytime that we put on retreats or conferences, it takes a lot of work to support that. So when you're seeing people like with tech support, then somebody's holding down the households usually to do that. So again, we just wanted to say gratitude for folks that are holding it down for our practitioners as they're helping us propagate Zen.
I was just thinking when you made the comment about in the corporate world, how your men want to hire men because women are going to work for a few years and then put to raise a child, and I find it really striking just that those men never took it a step further and thought, well, how can we make it so that this doesn't happen? And they thought, like, we'll just keep going. And I guess on the one hand, they sort of have that preconception of this is how women are and how they function, but also that wasn't important enough to sort of include women in the workforce in a more meaningful way. That sort of these sort of men who are supposedly such visionary leaders would really.
My experience in the corporate world is a little simpler than that, and I would just say that sociopaths tend to like other sociopaths.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Coming from a design background, it's all about problem definition, problem solving. So what you're saying is that men already have the problem all defined. And there's obviously only one solution, but they don't even ask the women to help define the problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's a very good observation. And even beyond the work requirements and that kind of stuff, it's just people that have the power, why would they want to give it up? I'm in charge. I don't want these women coming in here and taking my job, and I've got this under control. I don't need them. And you can apply that to just about any situation. The men in Buddhism, they had it the way they wanted it. Why should they change? And I'm not saying it's good. They should change. And hopefully the corporate world is changing today. I haven't been in the corporate world in 25 years, so I have to say everything with a grain of salt. But it was very, very true back when I was in the corporate world. It was just an attitude that she'll get pregnant and leave. Why take her away? Why spend $100,000 training her up, and when the odds are she's going to get pregnant and leave? Seems very logical.
Yes, these are all wonderful conversations, and somebody that's in the corporate world, I can say that it is changing, but because there are more women leaders. Our CEO is a female, and she's very aware of the challenges. And so as I think once you get people in those roles that have a different view, then they can actually imprint and have a different conversation. But it's another thing that I know that I want to put on the docket for us to discuss is the what in those scenarios when people are comfortable, what would motivate them to want to do something different. And that's a whole nother Dharma talk. But I mean, I want to, I have this conversation with my friends all the time. So like you're in this particular group of folks that are just getting all the benefit, then why would you want anything different? What would be the stimulus for that? So I'm just putting that on your docket, Ungan, Shinjin. Yeah, exactly. Right.
That is cool. All right.
So, and I know we're getting down to 2 minutes left, and I just want to see if there's any additional questions, comments online in the Zendo or on Facebook.
Oh no.
There's the camera.
Too many men talking, so I'm stopping.
Hey, this is my last week here, so if you're going to go to lunch with me, you better call this week.
I'm just now at a point where I'm my leg is good enough to drive. This week is great.
Yeah, and we prefer him have the good leg on the pedal to be able to navigate. So thank you for that.
Yeah, always bring the good leg.
All right, last call, questions or comments?
Actually, I don't. I hope this doesn't start like too long of a conversation, but I wanted to say I've actually been listening to your podcast.
Oh, really?
And yeah, and I listened to an episode recently where I think you had mentioned something about the nature of Zen being a little bit more like I think you might have used the word militaristic.
Yeah.
Or and you thought that that was kind of a reason that it was a little bit more appealing to men, and there tended to be more men present in the Zendo. And yeah, I found that really surprising and interesting. And I guess I just wondered if you had any other thoughts on it, or like if anybody else has any thoughts about that as a concept.
Yeah, I guess I can explain what I meant by that. There's a lot of whether this is like innate in Zen or if it's just like how a lot of people think about it, of just like sitting for long periods of time and it being like almost like a challenge, like I'm gonna sit all day long in a retreat, and sort of like this intensity, and just even some of the phrasing that we use, like we'll have like Dharma combat, um you know some of the it feels like sometimes it feels like I don't think I can do as well as the men because I'm not like as physically able. I'm a disabled person. I don't know if I can, as a woman, just like if I can really like fit into the militaristic like things that we do in Zen, and I don't think that I don't think it's like innately Zen. I just think that when you have a lot of men here, they might kind of really like appreciate the militaristic ideas surrounding it. So the long sitting practices, the Dharma combat, and anyway, sure. Well, I think Sensei would probably explain it better than me.
Yeah, it's just a place where people come up and throw challenging questions and just go back and forth. Everybody watches. Yeah.
Yeah, poetry slam.
One more thing on that one. The gentleman asked Ray if he has something to say. He's quiet now. Zen, I think women have it already more than men, but men need it more.
That's a sexist thing to say.
The only thing when y'all were talking about the Buddha and some of these other folks and working within the culture, I kept thinking about something analogous in the United States is how Abraham Lincoln I think in his heart of heart, he always hated slavery and wanted to end, but he couldn't come out publicly and run that way. He didn't run as an abolitionist, he ran as a free soiler, which he wanted to prevent slavery from spreading to the other territories. But as soon as he had the chance, he issued the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, destroyed slavery in the southern states. Eventually, he pushed for the 13th Amendment. But he had to work at first within the confines. If he had come out as an abolitionist, he wouldn't have ever gotten elected. So, anyway, that's what I was thinking as y'all were kind of saying how they were working in the culture that they were in. Anyway.
Thank you. As one of the things I heard about Lincoln was that he used as an excuse for the proclamation that if we set the slaves free, they'll help us win the war. He didn't come out and say, well, I'm anti-slavery, but they can help us win the war.
Well, he knew it would break the Southern economy. It would break the Southern economy.
Yep.
I think Ungan, amongst several of our other members, is an actual military person. He was very active in the military, and I think he can probably help Inga understand the difference between Zen and militarism. Can't you?
That's a toughie. The outward behavior probably looks very similar, but the inner motivation is completely different. Again, as a junior officer in the infantry, my job description, mission statement was to close with and kill or capture the enemy by any means available. That's not very Zen-like.
Well, it depends on how you define the enemy.
Next.
Close in, capture, and kill the self.
Yeah, nice.
That's a good one.
Ungan, again, thank you so very much for your. Oh, do we have a question? I'm sorry.
Corolla has her hand.
Corolla, sorry, Corolla. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to point out that Lincoln was opposed to slavery, but he did not think that Africans were the equivalent of white people. So he inched the country forward, but he too was still embedded in what he was born into, and that's all we can do sometimes.
Thank you, Eugene.
I agree, Corolla. I agree. You know, you're limited by your environment. There's just no question about it. Yeah.
We're limited by the conditions in which we arise.
I wanted to make one exception to that, and that's the philosopher Schopenhauer, who lived in the 18th century around that same time of the formation of this country. And he makes such now pretty conventionally acceptable statements as there is no such thing as the white race. And he points out a lot of things that where he shows that, and he's often called a Zen philosopher, because we're really not constrained to a culture.
But we have to learn that.
That's the key. Again, everyone, thank you so very much. Again, Ungan, thank you so much for your practice, your presence, your teaching, and leading the conversation. Also, Shinjin Sensei for being first questioner. And as always, we are so grateful for each and every single one of you in your practice and showing up to practice with us. We're also grateful for those who are our consistent contributors and that keep things moving and supporting us propagating Zen, our teacher, and our space. And then if you're not one of those consistent givers, we ask that you consider becoming one or getting involved. So check out all of our activities at ASZC.org. Again, a shout out just for Ungan next week, his Shuso. Come and ready to have your questions and conversations. It will be a very fruitful conversation, I'm sure, as always, as everything else is with Ungan. Again, thank you for your practice and your presence, and we'll go ahead and do the closing Dharma verses led by Hojo Sensei.
It's also in the book. You might want to share it.
Things are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it.
Again, everyone, thank you for your practice and your presence. Again, do not hesitate to contact us if you need anything, ASZC.org or ASZCinfo@gmail.com. Again, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the week.